Church ministry is a unique sort of workplace. Its porous nature means you can be at one moment leading while also engaging with your own family, socially with friends, and connecting with your community. Not many people take their children to work with them, but for a church leader or children's minister, you're often leading a group including your own children, who can make your job easier or harder. For most of us, serving the church is a vocation, a calling, not just a day job. And it's not always clear when you're on and when you're off, when the hours of work start and stop. Working for church means caring for the people in your community, prayerfully carrying them in your heart all of the time. The boundaries are fuzzy. You may be socialising with a family from church when they share about a problem they're facing. Are they asking you for pastoral support as their leader, or just telling you as a friend? And what about accountability? You're accountable to trustees, elders, perhaps a bishop or your denomination, but in many of these cases, you're also providing direction, vision, and pastoral care to those very same people. Now throw into this already confusing setting the idea of line management. All of us benefit from support, mentoring, and accountability in our work. It helps us grow and reflect on our practice, but it's not always clear who a church leader is ultimately answering to. Is it God, the church, the denomination? And how regular or structured are those conversations? These challenges are often highlighted when a church employs a children's or youth worker. The structures of management and accountability may be loose or informal, and this can lead to frustration, relational conflict, and burnout, things we'd all like to avoid. I'm Melanie Cave, and today I'm talking to Ali Campbell, a youth and children's ministry consultant with decades of experience in ministry and supporting churches. We discuss what employment and line management in the church could or should be like, and how we can better support those who are working with us, so we can all stay healthy and flourish in the ministry we're called to. Thanks for joining us on the Roots for Churches podcast. Here we go. Hello, Ali. It's great to have you on the Roots for Churches podcast. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me, Melanie. It is a joy to be with you.
Great. So today we're going to talk about line management in the church. And that may feel a little bit of a out there topic, but in some churches, there isn't very much line management. Maybe there's only one person working there. Maybe you've got a volunteer children's worker or a youth worker. Maybe you're in a big church and there's lots of line management going on. And hopefully this conversation will help you if you are someone who would like a bit more line management. Maybe you're not being managed very much, or if you're a church leader and you have people that you are looking after. So this will work from both sides. Before we get started, Ali, can you tell people a bit about yourself and why you are passionate about this topic?
Yeah, so I've been involved in children's youth ministry for 39 years now,
Wow.
Which is a bit mad. So started when I was 18, and at the age of 18, I was volunteer kind of Sunday school superintendent in my church. And I did that for a decade, and that with no support really. So it was just me trying to make it work, and had volunteers coming and going and joining in for a little while. I grew up in a Baptist church, very much had a sense of duty to what I'm doing. So I did it for a decade, wondering why everybody else was kind of flaky and not sticking with it. I thought, I'm the youngest person on the team and I'm the only one still doing it. So I went through that kind of as there is nobody kind of managing me, helping me think about what I'm doing, how I'm doing it. And I then parked it. I never really thought about it again. Worked for a church as their youth pastor, then worked for a diocese for 9.5 years as their youth and children's advisor. And it was then that I really started to notice where line management was non-existent, people weren't supported. And I guess for me, the biggest issue is not, do you have line management supervision? Is there wraparound care for people that you are employing or people who have areas of ministry they're responsible for? How do you support them that means they can flourish in what they're bringing and doing for the local church? And line management is a piece of that, but there's a wider thing around how we help people care for themselves, look after themselves, prioritize their own mental well-being and spiritual well-being in the midst of doing ministry. And often when it's frontline ministry, it doesn't end. There isn't an in tray and an out tray. You're working with people, and people are messy and brilliant and infuriating all at the same time. And when you're working with children and young people, just sort of add fast forward to that as they continue to change and grow and develop and all the rest of it. So it's a challenging environment to work in. And often churches' expectations are quite high. But for the worker, they're not quite sure whether they're ever hitting it, meeting those expectations. Should they even be meeting those expectations? Is there a bigger thing they should be thinking about in terms of how they're doing their job? And line management is part of helping people navigate that well. And that's good support for both the employee or volunteer, and also actually for the church leader to have a good understanding of what's happening and how it's happening. Because there's a strategic reason to be involved in line management and supporting those that you employ. So I noticed lots of bad practice, I guess. Either people never having a meeting, or a church leader thinking half an hour down the pub once every 3 months was a line management meeting, and that would do. Job descriptions that had 40 things on them, with the final one being, and anything else you're asked to do.
That's a classic.
And people just expected to get on with all of that with no kind of which of these are the most important things for me to be doing. And again, even in a line management meeting, just how's it all going? Very kind of general things being discussed, rather than, well, can we talk about the specifics of what my role is, and I'm doing 70 hours a week, and is that right? Should I be, when you're only paying me for 35? So I noticed all of that stuff was going on. So I started to press into it, thinking, some of this just isn't right and not helpful. And people are burning out. People are leaving the roles they're passionate about because they just don't feel supported. So that's where I started to press into trying to equip churches, also those who are working for churches. This is a long kind of introduction to it, really. But then in 2019, so fast forward to then, I did a terms and conditions survey, which I did for the Bishop of Leicester. Over 600 people took part in that survey, which I think is still the largest survey of its kind of looking at what children's youth workers experiences. And 3 key things came out of that: a struggle to look after their own well-being in ministry, the significance in terms of support, and within that, a lack of good line management that people identified as being a challenge. And also a sense of call to vocation, and a real sense of, this is what I want to do for the rest of my life, children's, youth and family ministry. Is the church going to enable me to do that? And what does that look like? So because line management became a feature of that survey, I realized this isn't just what I've encountered. This is a national issue that we're not doing it well. We're not making it happen well for people, and we need to get better at it.
Because it does surprise me, because you think in almost any business, people think as soon as you employ somebody, somebody has to manage that person. And that somehow in the church, that hasn't been the default setting. Like, how have we got as far as we have, where that sort of structure isn't there? I mean, depending on your denomination, you may have supervision for a minister, you may have a bishop, you may have a deacon, you may have a PCC that gives you some accountability if you're the senior leader, but it seems to vary. And all of those, again, vary in terms of power and control structures of, who is really answerable to who, how much autonomy do you have to do what they say, are they really your boss or not? That in church feels a bit wishy-washy. And of course, we're all answerable to God, and we hear from God differently, and we connect with God differently. So that, it feels like we start on a wobbly foundation, or at least we're not all on the same page when we start. And then we think, we're going to roll this out for somebody that we've employed, potentially on a temporary contract, potentially a volunteer. And again, that feels even wobblier. How do I manage a volunteer? And we can manage volunteers. That is a thing. But people feel like, oh, well, I'm not paying them. And they might just walk away. We don't want to lose them. So how much can I push back and shape what they're doing? So I guess backing up a little bit and say, like, are there some values, some beliefs that we need to put in at the beginning about line management, supervision, accountability, that we need to take as read? And I think maybe those foundations aren't there at all.
Yeah, I think so. So the first thing I'd say is, if you're going to employ somebody, then there's employment law to actually think about. So you can't just employ somebody and then have no reference to employment law as part of that. So you have to think about the hours you're employing somebody for, how much you're going to pay them. You have to think about things like annual leave and maternity and paternity and grievance procedures. You have to have those things in place. There should really be a staff handbook for every church that employs people, but I still meet with churches where they haven't put that stuff in place, or they put a maternity policy together when somebody is pregnant and they have to do it, rather than it's just in place and they've thought about it in advance. And it feels sometimes as if churches are doing it on the fly. And really, if you're employing somebody for the first time, you need to seek HR advice and you need to employ somebody properly. You need to make sure you've got your job description, contract, person spec, all the stuff that you would have in place, that you've done that well, and you've got a good idea of what it is that you want. Why are you employing somebody? Do you even need to employ somebody? Are you actually doing stuff well with lead volunteers and volunteers involved in, are you employing because the church up the road is employing? So you think you have to join in with that because otherwise you look like you're not doing what you're supposed to be doing. All kinds of things that we kind of slide into employment sometimes rather than it's really a thought through process. But I think that the responsibilities that come with doing it, it's somebody's livelihood as well if you're employing somebody, so we have to take that seriously. And part of that is effective, good line management. And really, it's just about making sure that things are working properly and the job is being done. But in that kind of context, you're also supporting the worker, giving them what they need to do the job well. And often there are things that I discuss with churches and church leaders where it doesn't occur to them that somebody, if they've maybe employed them for a couple of years, might need a bit of professional development around areas that they're weaker in. It doesn't occur to them that that is part of what they should be offering as an employer. It doesn't occur to churches when it comes to kind of annual review of salary. What I was heartened by, I have to say, for lots of churches, they did think seriously as we came out of COVID and there was a significant spike in terms of inflation and the impact that had on people. Quite a lot of churches were increasing pay to try and keep in step with the cost of living crisis that we experienced together. So I was heartened by churches paying attention to that because often, I would say pre-COVID, that wasn't a thing churches really were very good at, even annually reviewing salary, thinking we need to put it up. The challenge for the wider church, this is true of every denomination, unlike if you are a stipendiary clergy person, whichever denomination you might be in, Methodist, Baptist, URC, Church of England, if you're ordained, there is, generally speaking, a benchmark in terms of pay. But if you're employing a children's, youth or family minister, there's no benchmark. There is whatever you want to pay them or not. So when I did the survey back in 2019, as low as 16,000 for a full-time post, which is illegal or was illegal then, and even more so now. You can't pay that for a full-time job. And then going up to kind of 35, 40,000 and everything in between. And a lot of those jobs to me looked very similar in terms of expectations of the role, the leadership required, the experience expected, etc. Just an example of churches having not a clue, where to kind of pitch it in terms of what they were going to pay. So within all of that, it's those things need to be thought about, and line management is just one piece of it. But line management particularly helps ensure that somebody has a sense of, this is why I'm doing what I'm doing. This is how I'm expected to do it. And I have these support things in place to enable me to do it well. So there's three things that I think make it. So accountability. So good line management is about accountability. And I would say that works in both ways. There's the accountability that you have as an employee to the person that has employed you, the church that's employed you. You want to do your job well, but you're accountable for it. So part of line management is making yourself accountable in that space. This is what I'm doing, so I'm working on. This is where we're up to. These are the challenges. These are things that I think might hold us back from doing what we want to do. But then also there is the accountability in the other direction, is the responsibility the employer has for how they're enabling that person to do the job that you've asked them to do. Is there any support you need to enable this to happen? You haven't taken your time off in the last 3 weeks. You need to take some time off in lieu. Whatever it is, where the line manager can just say, we need to be on track with things together. And that's part of them being accountable and ensuring that works in both directions. The other direction it needs to work in is the church leader needs to be accountable to the wider body that's employed. So if it's a PCC or diaconate or eldership, it's not the individual who is the line manager who's employed the person. It's the organization. And I think sometimes you can have a maverick leader that just decides what they're going to do and how they're going to do it, almost with no accountability, even if there is, in theory, diaconate, eldership, PCC. And because often those people are office holders rather than employees, I think a lot of them have a different understanding of what it is they're expected to do. Line managing them. And I think some of those leaders find it hard to line manage others because actually it's not something that they're sitting under themselves. So there's a wider accountability piece for church leaders that I would say to church leaders, who are you accountable to in terms of how you're leading your church? Where do you go to for support? Or are you just making it up on the fly and you're expecting those you employ to do the same? I think that's a recipe for disaster, to be honest.
Yeah, but I think there is a lot of loneliness in church leadership, of feeling like that you are being watched all the time, that you have to have your ducks all in a row, you have to be holy, you have to be constantly humble and learning and have the right answers. And perhaps we're moving out of that, but it still feels like that there's high expectation of the church leader to just be perfect all the time. So to have people that you really trust and can say, I'm struggling, I need support, you know, it's that crossover that happens where you need to be honest and you need support, but you also don't want to say to those who are paying your wage, I'm not coping, I'm not doing a good job, because then you think, well, will they get rid of me? Will they stop supporting me? Will I lose their confidence? Will they stop following my leadership? So creating safe spaces to have those kind of conversations, to be real whole people who are not robots and can't deliver at the same standard every single day, that's hard. And we can have really toxic cultures in churches, or just putting people on pedestals so that they can't ask for help. And we need to be honest with people and make sure that our senior leaders are accountable, but can also be authentic and real. And then I think that creates a culture within a church that then allows for good line management. But if, as you say, if the senior leader doesn't have that, they're not going to be able to model it for anybody else or feel safe enough to offer it.
No, it's hard, but I think I'll get into it a little bit because one of the key things that I think really matters is relationships. But for senior leaders, it's where are you able to be vulnerable, appropriately vulnerable with people that are supporting you as you lead. And I think I worry for leaders that put a distance between themselves and everybody else, not necessarily because there's anything going on that shouldn't be, but more just they just see their role as a leader as separate, as set apart. And I don't know that sometimes this is a different conversation in some ways, but I don't know that the way we select people for leadership and give the idea they're set apart is particularly helpful, because it sets us up to be different from those around us. We've got to find a balance between the priesthood of all believers and those who are called to specific roles within the church. And I still think we struggle with that and don't know quite what that looks like. But then that has a knock-on effect with how we lead and has a knock-on effect on the culture we create in our churches. So I love it when a leader says, my door is open, and they genuinely mean it, but also that they're willing to be challenged on their practice. And where I see that working well is leaders being willing to and continuing to say to people, I want to be teachable. I don't know that I've got it all sorted. Let's see what happens if we try this. If it doesn't work, we'll try something else. And if you don't think this is a good idea, you need to tell me. That's great. I'm encouraged by that kind of leadership. Other people, if you challenge them, it's as if it's a personal attack rather than you're saying, I'm not sure that's a good idea. What do you mean? You're attacking my idea? No. And then they've made it, suddenly it's about them. I'm like, calm down. It's not about you. I'm just asking a question about our direction of travel. So leaders recognizing they need support and recognizing they need help with things like line management. If you've never line managed anybody, then you need to know what you're doing, not just assume you can do it. And I think some leaders think, well, I should be able to do this, so I'm just going to have a go and hope it works out. It's okay to ask for help and also to seek support. That means you're setting things up in the right way for those that you've employed, but also for those who are volunteers and doing stuff that they also need support. So accountability is the first thing.
Yep.
Taking
Back
a long
to
time.
ACE. Yeah.
Yeah, I know,
Accountability.
trying to get back to that. The second thing is communication. So the reason line management is important, I know this sounds obvious in some ways, but communication between the person leading the church or the line manager and the person that's employed to do a job. I liken it to kind of, if you have porridge in the morning, and we're still on porridge in our house, although we're moving towards spring, so we're thinking less about whether we have porridge first thing in the morning. But if you leave it it's then sets like concrete. So you can have a bowl that you've had porridge in, you think, oh, I better wash that straight away, because otherwise it will be really hard to get the porridge off when you've finished. And I think in terms of communication in the church, it's a bit like that. It's like keep short accounts, keep regular contact. I think it's much better to have an hour's meeting once a fortnight than try and catch up once a term about stuff if you're line managing people, because then there is an ability to kind of just keep things really short in terms of accountability. You know, this is an area we're struggling with. We need to address this, rather than we've hit crisis point because we haven't talked for 3 months. It's all gone to pot, and we haven't had a chance to catch up. Much better to say, I'm just paying attention to this because I'm not sure how this is going to go. And then the church leader's in the loop. You're feeling okay that they're aware and they're supportive of it. And obviously that takes trust, but the fewer meetings you have, the longer it takes to build trust. And you really need to build in early on when you employ somebody. You need to have regular meetings that are about building trust, not just about what are we doing in the day-to-day nitty-gritty of the ministry activity. But actually it's about building trust and relationship, where you think, actually, I can bring something I'm concerned about, and they won't automatically assume I'm rubbish at my job. We can have a conversation and see how we can get to a better place.
But I think there's a challenge of, like, when you think somebody's been doing something for a while, you're like, oh, they're great, we don't need to meet as often. And I think that isn't true. I think it makes people think, okay, they're brand new in their job, they're going to need a bit of hand holding, I'll meet them regularly. But even if you've got a real go-getter who is confident, who's maybe done the role before or has done it in your church for a while, that's a person you want to walk alongside and say, what's new? What's going on? Where are you going? Because they're so confident, they will be pioneering, they will be moving things along at pace, and you want to track with them. If you meet them once every 3 months and they've started some whole new ministry because they're amazing like that, you know, this might be the first time you've heard about it, and you're like, oh, there's duplication, this person would have wanted to get on board, etc. So if you're not tracking with even these people who are really competent, you can end up feeling like you're just pulling their chain. You know, all of a sudden, nope, you can't do that. And then that will really cause conflict and frustration. So just because somebody seems really capable, you still need to connect with them. It's just a different kind of line management, isn't it? But it doesn't mean you can just leave them to do their own thing because they're not struggling. It's a communication thing, isn't it?
It is a communication thing. I guess the strangest thing that I find, and I find this a lot, is there are church leaders who do line management, who do meet with staff, but they've never seen their staff do anything. So they've never visited the kids' work. They've never visited the youth work. They don't actually know, for example, if you've got a midweek youth congregation, they don't know what the young people are being taught in that space. They've never gone there. Unless they've got young people in the youth group who are their spies and, you know, their own kids, for example, they're not going to hear what is happening directly, and they're not going to see it.
Yeah.
So, you know, I often say to church leaders, when was the last time you rocked up at the kids club or the youth club? Because ultimately you are responsible because you're the church leader. Yes, it's delegated responsibility, whether it's volunteers or people you've employed to lead it. But are you paying attention? Do you know what's happening in those spaces? And I recommend church leaders particularly go and hang out with the young people. They're part of your congregation as well. Yes, you've employed a youth worker, but go and do the tuck shop on a Friday night. Go and clear up at the end and have some time to chat to the team and find out how they're doing, the volunteers that are working alongside your employed staff, because that will give you greater insight to how the worker's doing than you just having a third-hand conversation in a line management meeting. It's a little bit like kind of the observation stuff that teachers get. Somebody comes in, watches them teach a lesson, and then they get feedback and they get reflections from that. That's just a normal part of lots of people's jobs. So I am a little bit gobsmacked. It doesn't really happen in church at all. People don't go and see it happening. And I don't suggest going to see it happening in order to catch something that you think shouldn't be happening.
This isn't Ofsted, isn't it?
No,
You don't want to create a fear narrative.
It's part of support, and it's part of championing what they're bringing. And it's also often a chance for you to see how brilliant they are. You know, you can have those kind of things happening in a line management meeting where they're saying, yeah, we've got this happening and this happening and this happening. And it all sounds very busy and crazy. And you think, well, I'm going to go and have a look and see what's actually going on. And then you can see how brilliant it is. And that just affirms what you're hearing often. Of course, if you've got somebody in a line management meeting saying, yeah, we've got 40 regularly coming along to this, that, and the other, and then you turn up and there's 3 and you realize it's been like that for 6 months. Something's not working somewhere.
They're under a lot of pressure to have
They're
the
under
numbers.
pressure, and it's not a numbers game. It really isn't. That's a whole different conversation. In fact, I'll just mention this as an aside. I was once encouraged to double the number of young people I was working with within a kind of year, and that was going to be written into my job description. And I said, I think I'll tell you what, I'll do it if you promise to try and double the number of adults in the church within the next year. I'll double the young people if you double the adults. Let's do it.
Good on
You
you.
and me, let's do it together. Let's go for it. That disappeared from the conversation about what was going to find its way into my job description.
Funny.
Because suddenly it was like, oh no, I can't do that. Well, stop asking me to do what you can't do or aren't willing to do yourself.
Yeah.
But then I was a bit older. I was a bit more bolshy. I think it's harder if you're 21, 22. So this is my third thing: accountability, communication, and then expectations. What are the expectations on you? And it's remembering expectations come at us in different ways. There's the expectations the church has, the wider congregation, expectations young people have, children have, expectations parents have, and the church leader has of the direction of travel they want the church to go in. And then there's also, which we can forget about, our own expectations of what we think we can bring. And then God, what does God expect of me in this role? Irrespective of what everybody else is saying I should or shouldn't be doing, what's God asking me to do? So if you've got a list of 40 things in your job description, how do you bring that in a line management meeting? Where do you kind of think, well, this is the stuff we need to talk about this week, and then these 4 things, and next week, because I've got 40 things, it's another 4 things that we've got to address. So what I ask churches to think about, and the same for people who are employed, what are the 3 key things that this job is about? And if you were to percentage out the time you're expecting somebody to spend on those things, what would that look like?
Yeah.
Oh, well,
good.
It's a key role is, doing stuff in the community. So we're expecting them to be in schools. How much of their time is to be committed to that? 20%, 30%? And if they're on a 12-hour contract or a 35-hour contract, then that has specific hours you can sit alongside it, rather than just do whatever you want. Here's all of this stuff. We'd like it all to happen. It's just not doable. So sometimes job descriptions are unrealistic, and you don't really realize that until somebody's employed and trying to do it. And that's not whether they're competent or not. You've just asked too much.
Yeah.
And so
well, I
there
often think we want to employ Jesus. Like we write
well, if
these
we could, but
these
Jesus,
job descriptions for the Messiah. Literally, it's like only Jesus could do all this, and maybe not in a human body. Like because it's an 80-hour job that we want done in part-time
I
hours.
think that's the other thing where I think sometimes with leadership, we're not great if we're in senior leadership. And I think this is true for lots of leaders. They're not great at managing their own time. So they're even worse at managing other people's in lots of ways. Because you give 70 hours a week to a job, because you see it as your calling, and you might be on a stipend, you might be a priest and think, well, I'm not paid a salary. I'm available 24/7. If people need me, I'm there. And there's an expectation sometimes that you will have your staff do exactly the same. Even if they're on a very specific hours contract, you might expect the same. Something that frustrates me a little bit, that gets into the kind of nitty gritty of where things can go wrong, is when people are told what their gift to the church is going to be. So it's a bit like it's important that you're part of the community, so we expect you to join in with things, but then you're told what those things are going to be. So even if you're not working, you're expected to be at this meeting or this service or this thing, and you're told that's your giving. And my kind of attitude to that is, well, actually, it's my choice to decide what I give, not yours. Is that, am I required to be there? If I'm required to be there, it's work.
And it
If I
counts
have
as your
to be
hours,
there,
I suppose.
it's
Yeah.
part of my job. And sometimes that gets very fluffy depending upon a leadership's perspective. I've also heard churches that say Sunday is your gift, and the during the week stuff is your employed time. Hang on a minute. If on Sunday they're running the junior church or they're doing the youth stuff at the 11 o'clock service, that's their work.
Well, and they've probably been there since 8 setting up, and they'll
Well,
be there
there is
till
all of that.
till 1 talking to parents and filling out safeguarding forms. So
So,
not all of that is giving, is it? It's a
no.
lot of it is work.
And even with kind of joining in with the community, it's recognizing that there's boundaries are porous as far as the wider church is concerned. So you can be in a house group for your own stuff and being part of the community. And invariably, people are going to badge you about something that's going on with the youth work or the kids' work because you're in the room. So even there, you can't properly I just want to sit here in my house group, read the Bible with you, pray a bit, have some coffee and a nice cake. That's it.
Yeah.
No, you can't do that. You have to be in work mode.
Yeah.
So balance is really important. And I think church leaders aren't great at modeling it. But even church leaders saying to somebody they've employed, make sure that you take your time off. Now, if they see the church leader not doing that, it's quite hard to think, well, I feel a bit guilty because you're not doing it. They can say it till they're blue in the face. What really matters is modeling it, so do it. If you aren't taking your own time off, it's challenging for your staff to do it. It has to be a really confident person who will say, well, I'm going to take my time off anyway. Don't care what the vicar's doing. They're being a numpty by not taking their time. We should be taking our time off. But again, if you're kind of in your early 20s, you're just starting out, you want to not rock the boat, not kind of look like you're not joining in, not up for it in terms of kind of what's expected.
For some children's and youth workers, this may be their first job. Like them, they come out of school or university or a training program, and sometimes they're taken in as interns, so unpaid, doing lots of volunteering work. Sometimes they're taken on in this first role. They don't have a framework to go, okay, this is how a workplace could work. And they are looking to the leader, to the line manager, to show them work culture. And it can be really challenging because, again, there's not a classic 9 to 5 in church. Church is sort of 9 till 10 o'clock at night, and you're working with lots of volunteers. So there's lots of evenings and weekends. And so you think, well, there's stuff I need to do to prepare. I'll do that in the day. And then I end up working all the evenings as well. A lot of youth and children's works are part-time. And so then they're balancing another job or family. How do I do that? And as you say, because there's so much bleed in Christian ministry from social evenings, weekends, your social life, you're friends with the people that you're leading. When am I here as with my work hat on? When am I here as myself? When am I here as I'm just part of this church and I'm worshiping? All of that is very confusing. It's confusing for church leaders, but very, very confusing if that's your first job. Because you don't have any other framework to compare it to. And I think if we're not explicit with those expectations, I think a lot of people take on way more than we think they would take on because they want to do a good job and they feel called by God, and it's inspiring to work for a church and to reach out. So it's very tempting to see yourself as sort of giving your life to Jesus, giving your whole life to the church, giving yourself into this job, and set some very unhealthy patterns for your future life or for your future employment. And then we wonder why people don't stay. We wonder why they get burnt out. We wonder why they get frustrated or leave.
You can't, it's hard to pull back from it if you start wrong. So if you start, whether you're in your early 20s or when you start a new role at a church, it's kind of lay out your stall. This is what I'm willing to do. I'm always going to work my hours. And I know it's not a regular job. So what I recommend to people, and I don't speak to anybody when I do mentoring or support for people that are employed, I don't speak to anybody who is working only their hours.
Nobody just does that.
Nobody is doing it. So I'm kind of taking that as a given. That is a bit like where we're a bit like teachers. They're employed. They're doing loads of extra stuff in the evenings that they're not really employed for, paid for, but they have to do it in order to get their job done. So you do have that dynamic going on, but I encourage people to think of a buffer. So your hours are X. What's your buffer that you're willing to step into in a given week? And recognize that actually, if your buffer is beginning to nudge into the red, you might give yourself an extra 5 hours buffer time that you think, okay, I recognize the flexibility that comes with this role. But if I slide into my buffer, then I need to recognize that I've got a limit at which point I won't work beyond that, whatever is required. And then people need to be hot on taking their loo time. They just do, so keep a record of it, not in a kind of to the minute craziness, but just be, okay, I've worked right up to from the morning right up until the late in the evening. I've worked a long day. So my own example from a Sunday would be getting to church at 8 o'clock in the morning, setting up, doing the 9:15 with kids, doing the 11 o'clock with young people, then back for the evening service, often before 6:30, sometimes preaching in the evening as well. So before the 6 o'clock, meeting to pray with team, then doing that, then doing upper room, which I used to do a thing which was young people stuff after church, and then down the pub with young adults when that was finished until closing time. And that was part of kind of my ministry day on a Sunday. Well, that would often, if you totted that up, that's 10 hours and I haven't got into the week yet, so it's easy to see how it becomes 45, 50 hours a week. But it's recognizing that that's more than a full day's work. That's a day and a half of work, really. So does it look like a lighter Monday morning? No, because I've got a staff meeting or because I've got other things that happen straight after Sunday. So where do you build in some flex? Where is it a lighter morning because of the work that you've done elsewhere? And sometimes I have noticed that with some church leaders, they're very good on their own day off. Because if they don't keep their own day off, that just everything else disappears. What they're less good on is, we're only working 2 sessions. If you split the day into 3 sessions, morning, afternoon, evening, lots of clergy will work effectively 12 hours a day, and then they'll have their day off. And that's why they keep it solid,
because they're exhausted.
They're exhausted and they're working the rest of the time that is available. But I encourage children's youth workers to think of work 2 sessions out of 3, and then make sure that if you ever do 3 sessions, which sometimes happens, then have a lighter day the day after, or build in when you're going to have a bit of time that comes back to you, whatever that looks like. And it's just as challenging in some ways for church leaders. But if you're a youth or children's worker and during the day you go for a walk and you sit somewhere having a coffee, or you go to the shops, it's weird how often people are like, oh, you're here. You meet somebody from the church just seeing you out and about, like you have a
Shouldn't
life.
you be at work?
See, I know. And it doesn't matter what the day is, really. There's that kind of reflection back to you. I remember when Lisa was teaching and we would go and see a film in a cinema, and kids from her school might occasionally be at the same cinema. So they would see Lisa, but just completely out of context. They were just like, what are you doing here? Like she was kept in a cupboard at school.
Well, yes,
Just wheeled
children
out.
do have that about teachers, don't they? They can't leave school. They're not allowed.
So, and with people in the congregation, they might have those kind of crazy expectations that you've got your head down at church preparing something, or you should be with children and young people, even if it's not possible right now because they're all at school, or you're not in school doing an assembly right this minute. But, you have done 4 assemblies this week already. You just haven't been there when I've done, or whatever it is.
But we can't live to fulfill everybody's perceptions, even if they're or expectations, because they are unrealistic. This is the thing of
So that's where I
this
think
is ridiculous, isn't it?
good line management recognizes that, but then also good line management creates space beyond the line management meeting for an accurate profile of the work, to be shared with the wider church. Whether that's creating space for you as the employed person to kind of share a little bit on a Sunday morning, write something regularly in the newsletter that goes out to people that just gives a flavor of, a day in the life of, or a flavor of what is happening, that kind of gives people that kind of picture. So a good line manager will create space for that to be part of what they see as this is what needs to happen as part of the profile for the work. So people have a better understanding of what's taking place. But what I was going to go on to say, so thinking about ACE, we've done that, accountability, communication, expectations, we've sort of covered that. And then balance. So set the bar is my next thing that I kind of mentioned to people. So balance is key. And with that is the boundaries thing that we've talked about. But if you don't get those things right, often the first thing to go is your attitude, because you're out of kilter, because you are tired, because you are, pushing yourself, feeling stressed and anxious about things. Attitude is one of those things that can be impacted hugely by what is the environment in which we're working. And it's hard not to then slide into comparison. So I've got terrible C's that are part of attitude going wrong. Comparison is the first one. Are we comparing ourselves with others? And somebody once said, comparison is the root of all inferiority. You think
Haven't heard
about that
that
for a
one.
moment. And in terms of thinking about how we compare ourselves, whether that's the church up the road, our senior leader who we think is next to God, or whatever it is, where we just think, I can't match up. So comparison, and then we move into competition, another C I don't like. Rather than kingdom, we're thinking about competition, competing with others, whether that's in our own staff team, who can work the hardest, who can do the longest hours, who's got the most activities running. The children's worker seems to be doing more than I'm doing as the youth worker. Therefore, I need to step up my game, or whatever it is. And then those things, if those things kind of don't they don't enable us to do better. They kind of just drive us into a further kind of frenzy around things. But then complaining can kick in, followed very quickly, sometimes by cynicism. What's the point? Why am I even doing it? And so when attitude starts to be, those things start to be noticed, we need to check ourselves and think, I'm not doing great. And we need to recognize that. And linked with that's relationships. So I once worked with somebody who boasted that they knew their cell group better than they knew their own young people, their own family, their own kids. So, and they did do it as a boast. It wasn't a kind of, I know my youth group better than I know my kids. What am I doing? It was more a kind of like, I know my youth group better than I know my own children, like a badge of honor. I'm like, that is not a badge I want.
Your family are going to need you.
I don't want to miss, I don't want to miss kids' birthdays and significant moments because I'm doing ministry. I don't think that is what God calls us to. I know lots of church leaders, sadly, who have done that through their ministry, and that's had an impact on their own families. So I think it's about that comes back to that balance question. But also it is a question we need to ask ourselves about ministry. Is ministry only effective if I'm doing it? Because if I can't step away from it for 5 minutes in case it all goes to pot, I've misunderstood. I'm not the savior. Jesus is. And, neither is my senior leader the savior. So we need to really kind of think about our perspective on ministry, what our role is, where we fit within God's plan, God's purposes. And yes, we're called, and yes, we get to join in with something incredible, but it also isn't about us. It's about what he's doing through us, what he enables through us, and also what he can do when we're not there. Sometimes I've been frustrated when I've missed a week with my youth. When I was employed in the church, I missed a week. My volunteer team would step up and lead it, and I'd hear how fantastic it was. When I wasn't there, I'd be like, what's the point of me then? But that's not.
That's
But
not
then,
the point, because it's not about you.
well,
It's
it's
about
not
it worked really well. You've empowered a
exactly.
great group of people that can do it without you. That's a good thing. Yeah.
Then the flip is also thinking, look what God's enabled, because you've created a culture where
Yeah.
people can step up.
Yeah.
And some people talk to me about the kind of challenge of finding people to volunteer and join in with things. And my question often is, do you give space for anybody to bring their gifting? Or do you have to lead everything and make it all happen so people are just warm bodies in the room to enable you to do your ministry? And that's a challenging question to ask. But if you go through volunteers like there's no tomorrow, it's possibly a question you do need to reflect on. Everybody's flaky, or you don't let anybody do anything.
Yeah. They don't feel like their contribution is
They don't
significant
feel like
enough for them to prioritize turning up.
So, there's lots of things that need to be looked at and, managed well. I would say that there's a tension sometimes between we manage tasks, we manage activity, but we lead people. And I sometimes think line managers don't necessarily get that balance right. The overall thing in a meeting with somebody that you're leading is that you are leading them, not just trying to help them manage the tasks and the things that they have to do. And again, there is a tension because at the same time, you want the job to be done, but you're also leading this person. So how are you equipping them? What are you putting around them that means they feel supported and encouraged? And do you notice them, much like we might say with children that can sometimes, shall we say, be frustrating, is catch them doing stuff that we can be chuffed about and notice and cheer them on, even if it's a small thing. So as church leaders, being able to say something positive about the activity that your employed workers doing, for some people, they'll float around on cloud nine for 6 months because their senior leaders said, that was fantastic what you brought there. That was really good. But some leaders never even do it. They just don't mention anything. You can preach a blinder and the church leader just like, great, thanks, or nothing. So give me feedback. I don't mind if it was a disaster. Just tell me something that I can work on or whatever. So
but if you give lots of positive feedback, your negative feedback doesn't floor them. Like if you're regularly appreciating, commenting on stuff. I mean, culturally, we can be so subtle with our negative feedback sometimes. It's like that, then people read into it like, well, there was no positive feedback, it must have been awful. Or so we need to be clearer in our communication to people, what we do like, what we don't like, rather than hoping and expecting they can read our minds.
There are some ways of doing it that you're encouraging at the same time as you're reminding them that maybe they didn't do everything they could have done. Like what I've seen most often, and I see it in myself, so I notice it when other people do it as well, is if I'm given a topic and I don't preach very often, so then I try and say everything I know about that topic. I don't know when I'm going to get a chance to do this again. So you shove everything into it. Yeah. So, a good reflection from Lisa might be, my wife, that was 4 great sermons, but you were only asked to do 1.
Yeah.
It's like, yeah, okay.
Leave him wanting more.
Or you seem to be really enjoying yourself, but then you focused more on trying to be funny than what you were trying to say. And again, that can be a tendency I have. And that's not negative feedback. It's great that you can be funny, and sometimes that helps bring a point across. But when the focus becomes the funny, have you missed the point of the sermon? Because do you want people to go out remembering the funny illustration or remembering that you were saying this about Jesus? What do you want people to remember? I'm like, that's very good. I need to remember that.
Both, so, hopefully, both, because that would be the gem, both. Wouldn't it? Yeah.
It could be both, but I think there's that. So there's great stuff that can happen if a line manager is paying attention. So being in the youth group, like I was saying earlier, and being able to notice, I love how you worked the room and talked to nearly every young person, but you did it just really relationally and in a chilled way that made them feel welcome. Brilliant. What else do you need to say? You've paid attention to what they're doing and you've noticed that.
Yeah.
Or you notice how the volunteers have got one another's back and working together. And that's reflected by the kind of leadership that is being offered by the person who's employed. So you can reflect on that and say, I noticed your team were really cohesive and worked really well together. That's credit to you as the team leader. Brilliant. It's not a lot, but it's huge stuff for somebody who's employed. Markers that's being noticed that tell me I'm doing a good job.
Yeah.
Otherwise, people are just, I've no idea. Is what I'm doing working? Does it make a difference? Nobody's telling me anything.
And that often children and young people are not the ones who come up and say, that was amazing, thank you so much. I mean, you can tell if they're engaged or not, but sometimes they look bored and they've actually had a really deep moment. You might get thanks from the parents, but then that can feel a little bit like they weren't here. So you're thanking me for looking after your kid for the evening while you were somewhere else. So to have somebody who actually gets it, gets what you're going after, to affirm something, I think youth leaders and children's leaders often feel invisible because it's not profiled, there's not the adults recognizing them. So those words go much further than we think they would. We all like a bit of affirmation, but I think it's so critical, particularly for youth and children's volunteers.
They totally do. And sharing them at the right time is important, and not being over the top with it, just recognizing the need for it. It's doing it in a way that is regular and meaningful. So it's not a bland statement. It's you're identifying something very specific that you can cheer them on about or celebrate with them. And I think in terms of thinking about other things to do with line management, is one of the things I notice that sometimes happens is you can have a good conversation about what's happening and there's some clarity around it, but there's no follow-up or action points or things off the back of a meeting. And that can happen in a wider context. So I remember being part of a team where the church leader got into kind of like, we're going to read a book together. So he bought a book for everybody, and then we were going to go through it, and we were going to do a chapter and then spend the first 5-10 minutes of a staff meeting reflecting on the chapter, just sharing what people thought about it. I thought this is great, brilliant. So we all had the book. First meeting we had after we got the book, we did the chapter and we all kind of reflected on it. And then we didn't do it again. So we only did chapter 1. And then I think he realized, we should do this again. So we bought another book and we didn't even look at that one. So in the end, we're just like, he's just buying us free books. That's fine. We began to gradually realize we were never going to look at them. So the challenge really is if you set kind of any kind of expectations within a line management meeting, follow up and actually do it, so know that the worker knows next time we're going to be talking about Easter. And that sounds like a long way away, but we're now in January, Easter's coming. What are my plans for additional activities? And we want to be a bit more intergenerational as a community at Easter. So how does the youth work fit into that? How does the children's work fit into that? So I'm being encouraged to bring a plan to the next staff meeting or line management meeting. And then if that's never mentioned again, the worker begins to think, well, it doesn't really matter what I bring, because nothing really is paid attention to, or it doesn't happen, or we don't go anywhere with it. And then people get a little bit lazy with it, not out of their own intention to be lazy, but just because I'm not putting effort into something. If when I bring it, it's like just completely off the radar. The other thing sometimes I see line managers do is let's brainstorm. Let's have a real think about what we could do together. And you get all excited about what you might do. And then they say, that's brilliant. That's brilliant. I'm really glad you shared that. This is what we're going to do. It's like, well, don't ask people what they think.
None of their ideas get used.
It doesn't matter. Just do it or don't do it. But, so don't say to somebody, I'd love to have your input on this as we think about this and what we're going to do together. And you think, great, I've never been asked my input before in this way. So then you kind of share it. Doesn't mean anything. Doesn't matter. It's not going to happen. It is really demotivating. And it's just a way of not supporting people, not hearing their voice properly. And we do it with children and young people as well sometimes, tokenism, where we pay lip service to hearing what they think, and then we don't action anything that they bring or don't reflect on it further with them and say, that's a brilliant idea. Here's why it might work. Here's some of the challenges. How do we overcome those? But let's really think about what it might look like to do it. We need to do the same when we're kind of working with staff, not promise things that just don't ever come to be. And so don't overdo it with line management, where you want to be really encouraging, but then nothing that you offer or create the space for ever happens. So if you've got action points, do them, essentially.
It's integrity, isn't it?
Follow through.
So can we just have a side about managing volunteers? So quite often people in churches will be volunteers. Maybe they're somebody who's retired. Maybe it's somebody who doesn't need to be employed. They're independently wealthy, great, and they're volunteering their time. They can still benefit from being managed, especially if they're given significant responsibility, like they're bottom lining something. Having some line management would be very, very important. I'm not saying you need to have line management with everybody who volunteers in your church, but if you've got somebody doing some significant amount of volunteering, is there a difference in how you would approach it, or would you approach it exactly the same?
I think some things I'd approach exactly the same. So are they doing what we could employ somebody to do? If they're effectively doing the same job, then there should be similar things in place to support them. Now, it might not be practical to have a fortnightly line management meeting, but what does it look like to meet regularly in a way that would suit somebody who's volunteering their time, might have a full-time job? The other reason it's really important is succession planning. So there are churches where the lead volunteer has been doing it for 30 years.
Yeah.
So we've never thought about it. We've never needed to think about it because Doris leads the junior church and has done since before most of us were alive. And she's great at it. She's loved by the kids. She's doing it year on year. And then one day Doris turns around and says, I'm done. Next week's my last week. And the entire thing,
Quick, shut the church.
anything that was happening in the church ceases to exist because Doris isn't doing it anymore. So there needs to be a kind of alongsideness with volunteers that recognizes the value of their work, but also recognizes they are a volunteer. So in terms of their time, they're not required to do it. So
They don't have
navigating
a notice period. They
they
can literally not
they
turn
can
up.
literally just stop. And what are you going to do? You can't fire them. So you have to just navigate that well with people. And also recognize, however brilliant Doris is, they're doing the work. But, in terms of thinking about what it looks like for them to lay it down, are they any good at building team? What does that look like? Are there people coming through that will then join in more fully? Or actually, are they stuck in their ways, or they're doing it in a particular way that means it's more challenging for other people to join in? And also, I would say that for some volunteers, they've seen 6, 7 clergy come and go, and they think they're running the church more than the clergy are. So you have to navigate that well with people. and help them recognize that they do need to come under authority a little bit. It's not just a free for all, you do what you like. And yes, I know you're a volunteer, but we have to do certain things.
Yeah, and it may
And
be
then the
about
other,
training and upskilling and making sure it's joined in with everything else. Because if they're a bit of a lone ranger or a law unto themselves, what they're doing doesn't always fit into the bigger strategy and policies that are going on.
no. And for balance, there are phenomenal volunteers who are leading work who are like hen's teeth. You're not having to pay them, but they're better than many salaried workers are in terms of what they're bringing and how they're doing it. So the reason to meet with them regularly is to support them and help them to realize how valued what they bring is.
Yeah.
If it's just happening over there and you just think they're so fabulous, I don't even need to kind of even look at it because I know they're brilliant. Actually, it really does affirm them by recognizing it, even if you just only catch up once half a term. Say, tell me how it's going, anything you need, how can we support you? Have you noticed there's these things on offer from the diocese? Is there anybody on the team that might benefit from that? Whatever it is, that means they come away from that feeling you're paying attention to what we're doing.
You
The
value
work
it.
is valued by the senior leadership. I'm not on my own in it. And within that, there's also stuff that they have to do. They have to be doing risk assessments. They have to have done safeguarding training. They have to be DBSing volunteers who are going to have particular responsibilities for children and young people. And, do the volunteers have a way of plugging into the support that's there that an employed person might naturally have? You need to create pathways that maybe not
Yeah.
aren't there in the same way, but they need that same stuff to be part of their support.
It's good. Good advice. And last question to finish is for those who might have come from a work background in some sort of secular industry, they've had an experience of line management and they're coming into a church setting or I guess my question is there something that is totally different about line management in a church setting? My hunch is that there is more of this crossover of that you are in a discipleship, friendship, social setting, and that there's more of this sort of mentoring thing going on. So can you speak to that? If people I do lots of line management in my work setting, how is this different at church? What do you notice that's different?
So I guess the first thing to notice really is we're intergenerational community. If you've got children, young people, adults, so you may be the youth minister, but the kids of your line manager are in your youth group.
Yeah. There's a lot of
Your own
crossover.
kids might be in your youth group. Your friends' kids are in the youth group or whatever it is. So the kind of porous nature of it, and this is something that organizations like the National Youth Agency that support statutory youth work don't fully understand about Christian community and what it looks like. And so there are often professional barriers that we put in place. It would be unusual in a community youth work setting for a young person to come along to a statutory youth club and know where the youth worker lived and potentially be hanging out with that youth worker's kids
Hmm.
in their house or going to the cinema with them because they're in the same school. It just wouldn't be something where you'd see those kind of relational dynamics happening. Now, for me, in some ways, that means we need to be even hotter on our line management because we have these very kind of porous boundaries around community, around intergenerational stuff, around, we need to be we need to be the best there is at doing line management because they have all these extra things that are part of being part of community together. Same with safeguarding. We need to be excellent in safeguarding. We need to create a space where anybody can come in and they will flourish in the community that we're in together. And we put everything we can in place to enable that for as many people as possible. So for me, it is about kind of let's be excellent. Let's be prophetic about what's important about these different things and do them really, really, really well. So churches that aren't doing them at all need to get their act together. It's not good enough to not be doing line management. It's not good enough to not be creating an environment where people employed can flourish. And also, I think one of the challenges around that, which we've not had time really to touch on, is pay and what that looks like and what people are willing to pay, what they think a role is worth. I often say, here's my challenge to a PCC, particularly if you're in a kind of situation where people are employed and they've got quite good jobs, is just to say, so what are you earning? Why do you think the youth worker's worth half that if they're going to work for your church? What if we took the mean of the people employed on the PCC and we paid the youth worker that. Could we manage that? If we can't, maybe we need to rethink whether or not we should be employing somebody. I mean, even just asking the question should make people pause and think,
It does, yeah.
what am I asking people to do? You know, I'm on £60,000 a year moving widgets about. I don't know, whatever, I'm doing. But this person's working with my kids, discipling the next generation. Are those things less valuable? So we need to have the conversation, because I think sometimes we just think, well, it doesn't really matter what we pay them. What's the cheapest we can go so that we can get someone? That shouldn't be what we're
Church
thinking.
likes to get things on the cheap, don't we? We like to, if we can do something for free, if we can get a volunteer to do it, even better. And I don't know where that's come from, that sort of stingy attitude. But yeah, it's definitely in our pay.
If a worker's worth their wages, and if, the other thing that was just really significant from the research I did was we asked people the question, if you could stay in children's, youth and family ministry until retirement, if you could, would you? And 75% said they would, if it was possible. So we've got, much like we have people that feel called to the priesthood or called to church leadership, we've got a whole crowd of people called to serve children, young people and families for their lives. It's what they see as being their life calling. And surely as the church, we should be creating vocational pathways for people to step into that, champion it and bring it to the fore as much as we do other responsibilities and leadership roles within the church. And not aim to pay them less, but look at how we can bring equity in terms of what we offer. And that's a big ask for churches, but it is something we need to be asking.
I do think people have a mindset that we're going to be employing somebody who's 22, not somebody with a family, not somebody who has bills or a mortgage to pay. And so we think of the job as, well, they'll be fine with this. But it basically also caps who would apply for that job, because you would look at that and you think, well, I can't live on that if I'm going to put my kids in their clubs or in preschool or nursery or something like that, so I can do this job. I can't afford it.
But churches want to pay somebody who's 22 because they can pay a 22-year-old less, but they want that 22-year-old to have 10 years experience.
Yeah, and a degree, which they're going to be paying for in their student loans.
Those two things don't go together, really. So I do say, when you're employing, you've got to think about the responsibility that you're going to expect somebody to have, the qualifications, the experience that they need to bring. And also, just finally, a really important thing, the person spec's more important than the job description. So who you appoint's more important than what you want them to do. Because if they're doing a good job, in 3 years, the job will look completely different. Especially if you're asking somebody to start from scratch and start doing stuff that you're not really doing. And they grow a youth work, and then you think, whoa, okay, we didn't have any young people. Now we've got 25. What's it going to look like next? But it's the person that's made that happen, not because they've got these things in their job description. So really thinking through the kind of person you want. And for me, one of the most key things is, are they teachable? Are they willing to learn? Are they, recognizing that they're not the finished article? And which comes back full circle back to where we were starting with, leaders kind of maybe thinking, oh, I should be able to do this, and not willing to be vulnerable, recognizing their need to learn and grow. I was on a recent call with somebody who's really well known in youth work circles, and they're in their mid-70s now, and they're in this room wanting to learn from other people about how to do a particular thing. And that's the kind of leadership we need to be aspiring to. Somebody who's humble, with integrity, who wants to keep learning and keep bringing stuff. I will take, somebody who's 40 that can't play the guitar, that isn't going to do social media, but who is willing to learn and really loves young people, over somebody who's 22 and is arrogant and thinks they know it all and thinks they've got it all sorted and might potentially crash and burn within 18 months of being appointed. So it's appointing character over, they look cool, they're going to hang out really well with the young people. That isn't the direction of travel for us if we want to be sustaining youth and children's ministry with young people and having people that are going to invest in their lives because they love them. not because they're looking for a platform for what they're bringing or who they are. And I think that's much more important than the job description. So I'd also say to churches, if it takes you 2-3 times to appoint, do that rather than grab the first person that looks interested in the job. Make sure you're really after who God wants for you and your community, not just, wow, somebody's applied, let's grab them in case this never happens again. It is a difficult environment to appoint at the moment. It's very challenging, but wait for the right person. Don't just grab whoever just applies.
Yes, because when it's difficult and hard, it takes an awful lot of energy and time to manage that. So getting the right person that is the right fit for your church and having this line management in place will mean you've got longevity. They often say like the cost of recruiting somebody new, the cost of training somebody new is actually huge. So you want to keep people, you want to grow them with your organization and make sure that people, if they're leaving church, it's not because they've been badly managed.
Yeah.
And are burnt out.
If you invest in somebody, they will invest back. That just is how it works. They will. You'll see commitment grow. You'll see engagement grow. If somebody feels that I'm wanted here, I'm supported, the church is doing everything they can to enable me to do this ministry, why would I go somewhere else? I feel called to this community. I feel called to these children and young people. Brilliant. So creating an environment where people can flourish. That is what line management's all about, really. Doing that really well is just a piece of enabling that wider thing to happen. And it does cost. So does mean that as a church leader, there's things you can't do if you're going to be line managing somebody well. But it's so important to get it right. So
talking about humility, talking about being teachable, if you are in a position where you are line managing someone and you want extra support, you want some coaching, you think maybe I'm not doing this very well, where would you direct people to get support, say as a church leader, to line manage people well?
Okay, so there's some wonderful people that just do coaching and mentoring. So, and I can drop you a list of those that you can add to the show notes, if I can even say that. So they'd be great. And they're very keen to kind of work support with church leaders. You can also drop along to my website, theresource.org.uk. Drop me an email at ali@theresource.org.uk. Or also, I set up Paraclesis, which is the Association of Children's, Youth and Family Ministers, a couple of years ago. We have a church charter that's for churches to think through, are we putting these things in place to support our youth and children's ministry and those we've employed to do it, or our lead volunteers who are doing it? And also, children's, youth and family ministers themselves can join the association and be part of Paraclesis. We offer mentoring as part of that, monthly CPD, and ongoing support for people through a newsletter, and we do our weekly devotions for people in ministry. So just different things that are about supporting and enabling that kind of flourishing environment that we hope people will have.
Yeah, that's really helpful. So we'll put those in the show notes, links to those. And I do just encourage you, start these conversations with people you're already line managing. Say, I've listened to this podcast. I want to set up a bit more structure. I want to make this more regular. How can we do this better? And keep learning, keep growing. It's not too late. I know we said starting well is important, but you can start in the middle and that's still okay. And it improves things. So thank you so much, Ali, for your time, for your wisdom, and for your many thoughts on this. I think it's been really helpful, and hopefully it will create better working environments and more fruitful ministry across the country.
Thanks, Melanie.
Roots produce weekly and seasonal materials to help you lead great church. GREAT is an acronym for growing, relevant, engaging, authentic, and together. Alongside our weekly children's and youth sessions, preaching notes, song suggestions, prayers and intercessions, you can find seasonal resources for worship and outreach in your community. We have holiday clubs, Easter and nativity trails, light parties, school assemblies, topical sessions on angels, Halloween, anxiety, the resurrection, and where the Bible came from, as well as articles, videos and podcasts helping equip leaders in your church with practical leadership skills. Hot topics like ADHD and autism, and deep dives into theology linked to the Bible readings. To see all Roots has to offer, head to rootsforchurches.com to take out a free digital trial. If you enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe and share with others in your church and network, and leave a review as that helps others find it. Together, we can grow.